Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that is not about kings or queens or bloody battles, but about something almost as eternal and possibly just as tragic. Imagine a man standing on a train platform in Ireland in 1929 and not moving from that spot for what seems like forever. This man is Mr. O'Donnell, and his life is a precise repetition of the previous day and the day before that, and the day before that in a rhythm so meticulous that it could make a monk envious. He stands at the same platform gate every morning at exactly 7:35 wearing a suit that has seen better decades and a cap that is permanently tilted to the right because that is how he always thought it should be. His shoes are polished to a degree that suggests both pride and obsession, and he carries a small leather bag containing a brass ticket punch that has been his companion longer than any friend could hope to last. Mr. O'Donnell has a routine that would seem unbearable to almost anyone else. He waits for the train to arrive, which is always the same silver-gray engine with two carriages and a faint smell of coal that lingers for the entire mile before it stops at his platform. When it does, he punches exactly 214 tickets, no more, no less. Each punch is accompanied by a quiet click that echoes slightly in the empty platform, and to the unobservant, it might seem mechanical or meaningless. But to Mr. O'Donnell, each click is a heartbeat in the slow pulse of his day. Between punch number 107 and 108, he sips from a cup of milky tea that is always at exactly 11:17, and no one dares question why. The tea is lukewarm by the time it reaches his lips, and the milk has been stirred in the same clockwise motion 3 times and not 4, because 4 would be unlucky in Mr. O'Donnell's mind, and we will see that luck or the lack of it is a delicate line in the story of his life. His uniform is immaculate, yet frayed at the edges, and one could not tell whether it is the fabric wearing thin or the spirit inside him. Some days he pauses to watch a pigeon hop across the cobblestones, or a leaf tumble along the tracks, but he always returns his gaze to the gate. The whistle of the train fades, and the doors close, and as it leaves he does not move from his spot because the next train will arrive, and it will be exactly the same as the last, and he will greet it with the same calm resignation and the same brass punch. People have walked by and watched him for years, wondering whether he is mad or enlightened or both, and the answer remains elusive because Mr. O'Donnell neither notices nor cares. He exists as a fixture like the clock on the station wall or the iron railing by the steps, and yet he carries within him a story as complex and as secret as any king hiding in his castle. It is not just the repetition of the trains or the tickets that defines Mr. O'Donnell. It is the subtle rituals that mark the invisible borders of his existence. He counts the cracks in the platform each morning before the first train arrives and counts them again after the last train leaves. He straightens the benches with a precision that rivals the drill of a palace guard, and he hums tunes from old operas that no one alive seems to remember anymore. There is a faint sadness in his eyes that hints at something lost, perhaps a family, perhaps a past that he cannot recall, or perhaps a world that moved on while he remained stationary. He occasionally writes in a small notebook that he keeps in the inner pocket of his jacket, and the pages are filled with numbers and symbols and tiny drawings of trains that look remarkably alive yet frozen at the same time. What is remarkable is that Mr. O'Donnell does not appear lonely. There is a serenity in his ritual, a calm acceptance that the trains will continue to come and go, and that his ticket punching will always be exact and measured and comforting in its monotony. Yet there is an underlying tension because nothing is quite normal. The trains are all identical, the passengers wear the same expressions, the pigeons hop in the same patterns, and even the weather seems to repeat in a subtle loop as though nature itself is reluctant to break his spell. And then there is the question of what happens when something finally does break, when the tea is spilled, or the punch sticks, or a train fails to arrive. Would Mr. O'Donnell notice, or would he stand frozen in disbelief like a monarch seeing his kingdom vanish overnight? The suspense is almost imperceptible yet omnipresent, because in a world governed by repetition, even the slightest deviation becomes monumental and historically tragic. And so our tale floats over a world where everything seems familiar yet slightly askew, where time has slowed and elongated until a single man's minor actions become epic in their own right. He is not a king, yet his domain is the platform, his subjects are the passengers. And his law is the unbroken ritual of punch number 214 followed by tea at 11:17. Imagine the meticulousness, the obsession, the quiet devotion that is required to maintain such a life. And yet there is more to Mr. O'Donnell than met the eye. Hidden behind the slow blinking eyes and the careful alignment of his sleeves, there is a story of unfulfilled desire and missed opportunities of a young man who once dreamed of distant cities and yet chose a life of exact repetition and silent order because it is the only life he could manage, or perhaps the only life that made sense to him. By the afternoon, the station empties, the sunlight falls in muted stripes across the platform, and the shadow of Mr. O'Donnell stretches long and unbending as though it too is a prisoner of his routine. He watches a clock tick slowly and ponders not the future or the past, but only the moments in between, because for him the moments themselves are the only reality. Each passenger that boards the train is a minor variation in a pattern that has remained unchanged for decades, and he greets them with the same neutral nod that suggests both welcome and distance. And then comes the most curious part of his day. Just as the train disappears over the horizon, Mr. O'Donnell pauses and glances at the edge of the platform where a strange envelope has appeared. It is plain brown, unmarked, and for the first time in years it seems to disturb the uniformity of his existence. He hesitates slightly, and then reaches for it with hands that are steady, yet trembling ever so slightly, because the envelope is heavy with possibility and danger, and yet it is also oddly familiar. The punch is still in his other hand, the click still echoing faintly in his memory, and as he lifts the envelope, he notices a strange smell of coal, mixed with something floral that he cannot quite place. And then the words appear on the paper in careful handwriting, and they are not addressed to him, and yet they speak directly to him in a way that makes him pause. The sentence is brief, simple, and yet it carries a weight of history, a subtle sadness, and a question that might alter the pattern of his life forever. He reads it once and then twice, and the brass punch drops from his hand with a muted metallic thud that echoes across the empty station. And there he stands frozen, wondering whether the world has finally broken its own loop, or whether this is merely another repetition in disguise. The sun dips lower, the shadows lengthen, and Mr. O'Donnell remains staring at the envelope, the weight of decades of ritual and the possibility of change converging in a single fragile moment that is both terrifying and oddly exhilarating. Mr. O'Donnell stood motionless with the envelope in his hands, and the weight of every train he had ever punched pressing down on his shoulders. The brass punch lay forgotten at his feet, as though it had been exiled for its inability to deal with unpredictability. He turned the envelope over slowly, noting the neat folding and the strange faint aroma that seemed like a whisper from the past. For a man whose life had been measured in clicks and sips of milky tea 1117 precise, he now faced a variable that had no rhythm and no order. He hesitated and then slowly tore open the flap and unfolded the single sheet inside. The words were simple yet puzzling, and they suggested a meeting at a platform in another town at a time that had no meaning to him because he only existed here now in his eternal day of ticket punching. For a brief moment the world felt heavy with possibility, and yet absurdly fragile, as though someone had taken a ruler and drawn new lines on the map of his life, and he had not been consulted. He looked around, and the station appeared exactly as it had all morning, the benches still aligned, the cracks in the platform still counted, and the pigeons hopping in their tiny rehearsed pattern, yet something had changed. It was invisible yet undeniable, a shift that made the air feel slightly thicker and the light slightly colder. Mr. O'Donnell placed the envelope carefully in the inner pocket of his jacket and resumed his usual stance at the gate, yet his eyes wandered more than usual, and his thoughts moved along lines they had not touched in decades. Could he go to this meeting, or would it unravel everything he had meticulously built for himself? The question was almost unthinkable, because every decision he had ever made had led him here to click number 214 to tea at 11:17, to trains that were always identical, and yet somehow it was there gnawing quietly at him. The next train arrived without ceremony, and he punched tickets mechanically, counting each click, yet his mind drifted to the envelope, and the meeting, and the strange sense that his life might suddenly be more than a series of measured moments. A child leaned over the railing on the platform and asked for a ticket, and he handed it over with the usual nod, yet the gesture felt heavier than usual. It was almost as if the universe had decided to test his patience, his loyalty to repetition, and his comfort in solitude all at once. The train disappeared over the horizon, and he sipped his tea at 11:17, noticing that the milk had separated slightly, and the aroma was not quite right, yet he drank it anyway, because there is a strange pleasure in maintaining the smallest vestiges of order, even when everything else wobbles dangerously. By afternoon the station emptied again, and the shadows stretched longer across the platform, and he returned to the envelope and touched it as though it were a fragile bird. He considered ignoring it entirely and returning to the eternal cycle of trains and tickets and tea, but there was a tiny voice in the back of his mind, a voice he had not heard in decades, suggesting that perhaps the envelope had always been meant for him, and perhaps the train of his life could suddenly depart from the tracks it had always followed. He weighed the possibility against the comfort of the ritual, and for the first time he understood that rituals are only powerful until they are tested, and that some tests arrive silently in plain brown envelopes. Mr. O'Donnell closed his eyes and pictured what leaving would mean. It would mean trains that no longer mattered. It would mean mornings without the comfort of punch number 214 and tea at 11:17. It would mean stepping into a world where pigeons were unpredictable cracks in platforms multiplied endlessly, and benches were misaligned in ways that made the soul tremble. And yet it also meant potential experiences that were impossible to count or control, like laughter he had forgotten or conversations that did not follow a strict numerical pattern. He opened his eyes slowly, noticing that the sunlight had shifted ever so slightly, and the smell of coal mixed with flowers had become stronger, almost as though it were urging him toward movement and away from stasis. Right after that moment he realized that staying in place had made him almost invisible to time. Days had blurred into each other, years had become loops, and yet the envelope was tangible, and it demanded a response. He weighed each possibility, meticulously wondering if he could leave without breaking the invisible laws that governed his existence, and if breaking them meant liberation or annihilation. He considered asking someone for advice, but for decades no one had ever understood his peculiar existence, and he suspected that no one ever could. The envelope became heavier in his pocket with each passing minute, almost as though it contained not paper, but a fragment of destiny itself, and the thought made his pulse quicken in the most unusual way. And then came the part that made him laugh softly to himself because of the absurdity of it all. The train arrived again as it always did, and he greeted it with his usual neutral nod, but something was off. One of the passengers was staring directly at him, and it was the first time in years anyone had noticed him in a way that suggested recognition rather than simple courtesy. Their eyes met, and there was an odd understanding there, a recognition that he had existed not just in repetitive ritual, but in a slow-building tension that the rest of the world had ignored. He felt a peculiar thrill, not unlike the feeling of being watched in a dream where you are both actor and observer, and where each moment is slightly exaggerated and yet perfectly still. He resumed punching tickets and sipped his tea, but the world felt different, somehow, and the envelope pressed against his chest, reminding him that he could no longer remain entirely neutral. By evening the shadows stretched long and the pigeons had disappeared behind the station walls, and Mr. O'Donnell walked slowly to the far edge of the platform carrying the envelope. He felt the weight of decades in his shoulders, and the quiet expectation of the infinite number of tickets he had ever punched in his hands. The platform felt simultaneously familiar and alien, and he wondered whether leaving would make him a visitor in his own life, or whether it would finally allow him to see it in full. He opened the envelope again and read the words once more, and for the first time he noticed something he had never seen before. A tiny symbol in the corner of the page, a mark that was almost imperceptible yet undeniably present, suggesting that this meeting was not random, and that perhaps his eternal day of repetition was about to encounter a rupture so subtle yet so profound that it could change everything he had ever known. And then a faint whistle sounded in the distance, a whistle that did not belong to any train he had ever seen. It was softer, slower, almost like a sigh or a warning, and he froze in place, gripping the envelope tightly. His pulse quickened in a way that had no precedent in decades of perfectly measured moments. And for a fleeting instant he felt the impossible thrill of uncertainty brushing against the edges of his orderly life. The whistle faded, and he realized that this was the first anomaly of his eternal day, and that the path forward would demand something he had not exercised in years, something almost forgotten: courage and decision. He glanced down at the tracks and noticed that the horizon seemed to ripple subtly, as though the future was waiting and watching for him to choose. Mr. O'Donnell stood frozen for what could have been seconds or hours. The difference no longer mattered to him, because time had always been a gentle suggestion rather than a strict law. The envelope pressed against his chest, and the faint ripple on the horizon suggested that something outside his eternal repetition had begun to intrude. He adjusted his cap, tilted it slightly further right, and inhaled slowly as though drawing courage from the crisp Irish air which smelled faintly of coal and rain and memories he did not remember making. The whistle had faded entirely, and the platform was empty except for the shadows stretching thin and long across the cobblestones. He felt the weight of all 214 punches of the day pressing against his hands, and he wondered whether leaving his post would erase them entirely from existence or simply add a new layer to the infinite tally that had defined his life. He took a step forward toward the horizon and immediately stopped because his foot disturbed a pebble that rolled slightly and then rested, again as though uncertain. He bent down to straighten it and realized for the first time that his entire existence had been spent adjusting pebbles, arranging benches, counting cracks, and sipping tea at 11:17, and that now a ripple had appeared in the still water of his life that could not be ignored. He glanced at the envelope again, and the handwriting seemed to shift slightly as though the words had been aware of his hesitation and were nudging him gently forward. A shiver ran down his spine, not unpleasant, just unfamiliar, a sensation almost like excitement, but quieter, gentler, and infinitely more dangerous in its unpredictability. Mr. O'Donnell straightened up and took another step toward the edge of the platform, toward the ripple, which now seemed larger as though time itself were swelling in response to his decision. Right after that step, a train arrived from the opposite direction, one he had never seen before. The color was not silver gray, but deep navy with brass fittings, and the sound of the engine was softer and slower, almost like a heartbeat rather than a mechanical whistle. The doors opened and passengers disembarked, and Mr. O'Donnell noticed immediately that no one was in a hurry. They moved like dancers in a slow rehearsal, completely oblivious to the strict measures of minutes and seconds and ticket, numbers that had defined his previous encounters. It was mesmerizing and terrifying all at once. The brass punch in his jacket seemed to vibrate slightly, as though aware that it had become redundant in the presence of something larger, more fluid, and less quantifiable than clicks and sips and counts. He realized suddenly that this was not a train at all, but an invitation, a manifestation of change, and he could not tell if it was a trick of his imagination or a subtle bending of reality designed specifically for him. Mr. O'Donnell stepped onto the train platform of the new arrival, and the floorboards beneath his shoes felt unusually springy as though responding to his presence. The passengers turned and looked at him not with curiosity, but with calm acknowledgement, as though they had been expecting him for decades, even though decades of expectation had been silent and solitary in his own eternal day. One of them, a woman with hair as dark as a storm cloud and eyes that held the faintest trace of laughter, approached him without haste and handed him a ticket not for travel, but for presence. The ticket was blank, and yet it seemed to contain every possibility he had never allowed himself to imagine. Mr. O'Donnell examined it with careful hands and wondered if he should refuse or accept. Refusal was instinctual, like refusing to leave a perfectly counted row of benches, but acceptance was tempting, a soft whisper of life stretching beyond the measured clicks and the exact moments he had spent in faithful repetition. By the time the train bell rang softly and the doors began to close, Mr. O'Donnell made a decision. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed the envelope carefully onto the floor of the train, where it shimmered faintly as though approving of his choice. He stepped aboard, slowly feeling the floor beneath his shoes respond to each step. The passengers smiled faintly without words, and the train began to move not with the whistle and clatter of the old routine, but with a gentle undulation as though sliding through time itself. Outside the window, the platform shrank into the distance, and the sky carried a subtle hue of green and violet, as though nature itself were amused at his movement. Mr. O'Donnell clutched the brass punch one last time and then let it rest on the seat beside him, acknowledging the life he had lived and the comfort he had drawn from absolute repetition. Right after the train moved out of the station, he realized that he had no idea where it was going. He had never traveled before in the sense that this mattered. The horizon stretched infinitely, with tracks that curved unpredictably and fields that shimmered with the faintest trace of color he did not recognize. He noticed a pigeon flying beside the train, and for the first time it did not follow a predictable path. It dipped and turned and soared as if celebrating the strange departure from all expectation. Mr. O'Donnell felt a weight lift from his shoulders, not unpleasantly, just surprisingly freeing, as though he had carried decades of invisible luggage, and now it had been gently removed without ceremony. The envelope shimmered faintly from the corner of his vision, and he realized that it had been less of a directive and more of a catalyst, a subtle reminder that even the most carefully measured life can ripple outward if only one chooses to move. By nightfall, the train slowed as though preparing him for a pause in a world that was not entirely governed by repetition. The windows reflected the interior softly, and he noticed his own face as though he were seeing it for the first time. The lines were the same, the cap was the same, the eyes still carried the quiet sadness of decades of counting and clicking, but there was now a faint trace of something else, curiosity or wonder he could not name. Outside, the tracks curved through a countryside that glimmered faintly in silver light, and the stars above seemed unusually large, almost like watchful eyes, waiting for him to decide whether to continue or to stop. Mr. O'Donnell leaned back and realized that the eternal day he had lived had prepared him for this precise moment, and that perhaps repetition had been less a trap and more a rehearsal for an awakening that he had not dared anticipate. And then he noticed something in the corner of the carriage, a small brass key lying on the floor, as if it had always been there but had waited for this precise instant. He bent to pick it up, and the weight of it was heavier than he expected, almost as though it contained not metal but choice. He turned it over in his hand, noticing the tiny engraving of a train he did not recognize, and realized that the envelope had not told him this part. No one else in the carriage seemed to notice it or him, and yet the key called to him like a faint echo from a world that had been waiting for him to step forward. He felt a shiver run down his spine in the familiar yet unfamiliar way of first possibilities and new routines, and wondered whether this key was an invitation or a test or perhaps a reminder that even a life devoted entirely to ritual could hold secrets that demanded discovery. Mr. O'Donnell held the small brass key in his palm and felt an unusual warmth radiate from it, as though it contained not metal but intention. He examined the engraving closely. The tiny train seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light of the carriage, and he realized that he did not know what it unlocked or whether it mattered. For decades, his life had been a series of measured repetitions and exact motions, each one comforting in its predictable rhythm. And yet, here he was on a train that moved unpredictably with a key that promised uncertainty and possibility. He placed it carefully in the pocket of his jacket and settled back into the seat. The passengers remained silent and composed their eyes fixed on some distant invisible horizon, yet he felt a faint sensation that they were aware of his presence, in a way that no one had been for decades. The train wound through hills and valleys that were not familiar to him and yet seemed strangely familiar, in their gentle undulations and muted colors. Trees leaned lazily over streams that shimmered like liquid silver, and the wind whispered softly against the windows, carrying scents of distant lands and forgotten gardens. Mr. O'Donnell sipped from a small flask of tea he had tucked into his coat, because old habits die slowly, and noticed that the liquid tasted sweeter than usual, almost as though it were enhanced by the novelty of motion and change. He thought briefly of his eternal day of ticket punching and wondered whether all those precise movements had prepared him for this very instant, when the ordinary became extraordinary simply because he chose to step forward. Right after a gentle curve in the tracks, the train slowed as though approaching a station that existed in another rhythm of time entirely. The platform was empty yet alive in some imperceptible way, and he noticed the same faint ripple he had seen on the horizon when he first received the envelope. He stood and walked slowly toward it and realized that the brass key in his pocket seemed to pulse lightly, almost like a heartbeat of its own. There were no doors in sight, and yet the ripple suggested a threshold, a place where one could step from repetition into possibility. Mr. O'Donnell felt a curious tension in his shoulders, the weight of decades of routine pressing against him even as the invitation of the unknown whispered in the smallest nerve endings of his body. He knelt briefly on the platform and examined the cracks in the stones and the faint moss that grew between them, noticing that the pattern of growth was not symmetrical as it had always been on his eternal platform at home. A strange exhilaration ran through him at the realization that imperfection existed outside of his control and that perhaps there was beauty in the unpredictability of the world. The brass key seemed to grow warmer still, and he could not help but wonder whether it had been waiting all along for a hand that had been trained in precision yet willing to act without calculation for the first time. He rose slowly and walked toward the edge of the ripple. The air shimmered faintly, as though aware of his presence, and he hesitated briefly before extending his hand toward it and felt a slight vibration against his fingers, as if the world itself were acknowledging his courage. By now the stars above were larger and brighter than he remembered, seeing in decades of long nights standing at the same station, and the wind carried the faint scent of coal mixed with something floral that reminded him faintly of the envelope. He understood slowly that the ripple was not simply a distortion of time or space, but an invitation to step beyond all measurement into a reality that had always existed parallel to his own. The brass key in his pocket seemed to hum in subtle resonance with the ripple, and he realized that it was not the trains or the tickets or even the tea at 11:17 that defined him, but the willingness to act when faced with a choice that could break the monotony. His hands trembled faintly, but he felt alive in a way that he had not for decades, a quiet hum of awareness, vibrating through every nerve ending. Right after he touched the ripple, the world seemed to soften as though the edges of reality themselves had been polished slowly over centuries. Colors deepened, shadows lengthened, and the gentle murmur of the train faded to a distant hum as though it were part of a dream. Mr. O. Donald felt the sensation of floating lightly, not falling, not moving in the conventional sense, but being suspended between what had been and what could be. He glanced down at the key and noticed that the engraving of the tiny train had shifted slightly, almost as though it had grown in complexity, and he realized that this was no longer simply a key to a lock, but a key to movement, to choice, to the gentle unfolding of possibilities he had never allowed himself to consider. The ripple beckoned him forward, and he understood intuitively that stepping through it would not erase his eternal day of ticket punching, but would add another layer, a story of subtle discovery and quiet courage layered upon the familiar rhythms he had so long relied upon. He stepped closer to the ripple and noticed for the first time that there was another figure waiting. The figure was small and indistinct, wrapped in shadows that shifted subtly like smoke in the moonlight. Mr. O'Donnell could not discern the features clearly, yet he felt a calm familiarity, as though he had always known this presence in the hidden folds of his routine life. The figure extended a hand, and he realized faintly that the envelope he had carried, and the key he now held were somehow connected to this silent companion. There was no speech, no instruction, yet a subtle communication passed between them, a gentle acknowledgement that he had reached a threshold that required courage, patience, and trust. His heartbeat quickened slightly in the strange way of first unknown possibilities, and he realized that stepping through this ripple would change the contours of his existence forever. By the time he was fully aware of the situation, the train behind him had faded entirely into the distance, and the platform seemed suspended in a gentle twilight that had no beginning and no end. Mr. O. Donald held the brass key tightly and reached for the hand extended toward him, and the ripple shifted under his touch, a faint warmth spreading through his chest, as though every year of measured life was being recognized and repurposed. A sense of time stretched and contracted simultaneously, and he realized with a quiet thrill that this moment contained not only a choice, but also the first awareness of his own freedom after decades of infinite repetition. He inhaled slowly and stepped fully into the ripple, and the world shifted in a subtle ripple of light and sound, carrying him gently into something that resembled motion, yet felt more like awakening than travel. And then he noticed the faint outline of another station beyond the ripple, a place that resembled no place he had ever seen, and yet carried traces of his old platform in the alignment of benches and the spacing of cracks in the stones. There was a subtle invitation in the arrangement, a whisper that told him he had been expected and that this new reality had always been waiting for him to arrive at precisely this moment. The brass key grew warmer still, and the envelope that had guided him remained in his jacket pocket, humming faintly as though pleased with the unfolding of events. Mr. O'Donnell felt an unfamiliar thrill at the convergence of repetition and unpredictability, and realized that the eternal day of ticket punching had not ended, but had transformed into something gently infinite, something expansive and full of quiet possibility. Mr. O'Donnell found himself on a platform that was at once familiar and alien. The benches were aligned in neat rows like the ones he had spent decades adjusting, yet the wood was smoother and warmer to the touch. The cracks in the stones beneath his feet seemed less rigid, more forgiving, as though the platform itself were welcoming him into something new. The air carried a soft fragrance of coal and flowers mingled with something he could not name yet recognized instantly. The train he had arrived on had disappeared as silently as it had come, and the ripple he had stepped through lingered faintly at the edges of his vision, a gentle shimmer that reminded him of possibilities rather than limitations. He placed the brass key on a nearby bench and noticed that it pulsed faintly as though resonating with the platform itself, and he understood that he was expected to explore this place but without instructions and without timetable. He walked slowly down the platform, feeling each step as if it were both new and memorized at once. The shadows shifted softly across the stones, and the faint light suggested that time here was not strictly linear. He saw no passengers in the conventional sense, yet a sense of presence hovered in the air, almost like the memory of a crowd that existed in another rhythm of reality. He glanced down at the envelope in his pocket and felt its quiet hum reminding him that the journey had begun not with movement but with choice and acknowledgement. The weight of decades of repetition pressed gently against his consciousness, yet it no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it was like a familiar friend waiting to see how he would respond when faced with novelty for the first time in decades. Right after he reached the far end of the platform, he noticed a doorway framed by a faint glow, a light that seemed to pulse in gentle rhythm as if breathing. The doorway was unremarkable in size and shape, yet it carried a subtle insistence, a quiet promise that stepping through it would reveal something long-awaited and simultaneously unexpected. Mr. O'Donnell paused and considered the brass key in his pocket. He did not know what it unlocked or why it mattered in this place, yet instinctively he felt that it was necessary. He took a slow, deep breath and approached the doorway. The air seemed to hum faintly around him, and the shadows stretched and contracted subtly as though reacting to his presence. He lifted the key and inserted it into an unseen lock with almost no resistance. A soft click echoed across the platform, yet it was neither loud nor intrusive, just the quiet announcement of a choice realized. Stepping through the doorway, Mr. O'Donnell found himself in a hall lined with windows that looked out onto landscapes that shifted subtly with each blink of his eyes. Hills rolled gently into forests, and rivers that shimmered with silver light flowed without beginning or end. The air was warmer here and carried faint echoes of distant conversations, laughter that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. He noticed immediately that time moved differently, the seconds stretching and folding like fabric, yet without the sharp edges of his former routines. The brass key in his hand seemed to grow lighter, almost weightless, and the envelope in his pocket pulsed faintly, with an unseen energy as though pleased with the unfolding of events. He realized that this hall was neither entirely interior nor exterior, but a space suspended between realities, a bridge between repetition and choice. By now he felt a faint awareness of movement behind him, as though the hall itself were breathing. He turned and noticed a figure at the far end of the room, wrapped in shadow, yet distinctly human in shape. The figure did not speak, but extended a hand, and Mr. O'Donnell felt a quiet recognition, as though he had known this presence in the long hours of counting tickets and sipping tea. He stepped forward slowly, and the floor beneath him shifted softly, responding to each motion. As he approached the figure, he noticed faint symbols etched into the walls, symbols that seemed familiar, yet he could not identify their origin. They glimmered softly in the light, and he realized that they might contain guidance not in words, but in suggestion patterns that invited observation and interpretation. Right after he reached the figure, they moved together in silence, walking toward the largest window in the hall. The landscape beyond seemed to stretch infinitely, with tracks that curved and twisted like delicate threads through the hills. Mr. O'Donnell noticed tiny trains moving along the tracks, each one different from the last in size, color, and rhythm, and yet each one seemed to obey its own quiet rules. He realized that he was witnessing a world of motion and choice parallel to his former platform where repetition had ruled. His pulse quickened slightly, not in fear, but in the faint thrill of discovery. The brass key in his hand pulsed gently with each heartbeat, as if acknowledging that he had arrived at a threshold where his actions could shape the unfolding of events in ways he had not previously imagined. By evening, the hall dimmed softly, and the figures outside the window faded into twilight. Mr. O'Donnell felt the weight of decades of ticket punching, an 11:17 tea lift from him, entirely replaced by a quiet awareness of presence and possibility. He noticed the envelope pulsing in his pocket one final time and realized that its role had been both subtle and profound. It had drawn him out of repetition and toward action without ever dictating the steps to take. The brass key seemed to hum faintly in resonance with the hall, and the ripple beyond the doorway suggested that this space was alive and receptive to his choices. He understood finally that he had not abandoned his eternal day, but transformed it, layering new possibilities atop the old structure of precision and ritual. And then he noticed a small door at the base of the hall, almost hidden behind a column, a door that had not been visible before. The brass key pulsed insistently, as though it were urging him toward it, and he realized that there was another threshold, another step that would continue the journey he had begun. He felt a quiet thrill of anticipation and a faint tremor of fear as he approached it. He inserted the key, and the door swung open, silently revealing a faintly glowing staircase that descended into shadow. The platform behind him seemed distant, now the trains, and the tickets fading into memory, yet the presence of ritual lingered subtly in his bones, reminding him that the choices he made now were built upon decades of careful repetition. Mr. O'Donnell lingered at the threshold of the staircase for a moment longer, breathing in the faint scent of old wood, polished stone, and something else, something new, like the first breath of dawn after a lifetime of predictable days. Then, without hesitation, he took the first step downward. The staircase was neither steep nor shallow. It curved gently, as if guiding rather than challenging him. His hand slid across the smooth railing that pulsed softly beneath his fingertips, like the heartbeat of the place itself. Light emanated from no visible source, yet illuminated every surface with a muted silver glow, gentle and unwavering. With each step, the world he had known, the whistles, the timetables, the worn bench beside the 11:17 track seemed to slip further away, not lost but folded, like pages turned rather than torn. He walked for what felt like minutes or years, time no longer offering resistance or structure. The walls of the stairwell shifted subtly as he passed patterns emerging like memories, fading like dreams. There were shapes that resembled train lines intertwining. Others looked like pocket watches opened to reveal nothing but light inside. He traced one pattern with his finger and felt a warmth spread up his arm, as though the wall itself remembered him. The staircase finally opened into a circular chamber, vast and echoing, with a floor of polished stone that reflected the ceiling like still water. In the center stood a single wooden table. On it rested another envelope, cream-colored like the first, but thicker, sealed with dark wax pressed into the form of a railway clock without hands. He approached with caution, reverence, and something like curiosity sharpened into purpose. As his fingers touched the envelope, the chamber hummed faintly, the floor beneath his feet softening into warmth. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. It bore only a single sentence, written in the same neat ink as the first message he had received at his familiar old station. "Every track leads somewhere once walked." He read the sentence several times, letting it sink through him like tea warming chilled bones. Once walked, not once built, not once discovered. Once walked. The meaning was patient, waiting for him to meet it rather than forcing itself upon him. He folded the letter and placed it inside his coat, beside the first envelope, the one that had brought him across reality into possibility. The brass key hummed softly in his pocket, keeping rhythm not with time but within him. The chamber shifted then, not violently, but like breath. The walls rippled outward, and the space expanded into a grand hall lined with clocks. Hundreds, thousands, each one unique. Some tall and carved from dark woods, others small and delicate, encased in brass or glass or materials he could not name. None of them ticked. Their hands hovered motionless, as if waiting for something to begin. He felt no unease, only a strange forwardness, as though he had arrived precisely when he needed to. At the far end of the hall stood a man, or something like a man. Tall, thin, wrapped in a coat woven from shadows and faint gold threads. His face was not hidden, but instead seemed always just beyond recognition, like the memory of someone passed long ago. The figure did not speak, did not beckon. He simply stood like a fixed point in the shifting landscape of time. Mr. O'Donnell approached, each step soundless, each breath intentional. When he reached the distance of a handshake, the figure extended his hand wordlessly. Mr. O'Donnell took it. In that instant, the clocks trembled, though still without ticking. A soft wind impossible, for there were no windows moved through the hall. The man's voice entered Mr. O'Donnell's mind, not through sound, but through certainty. "You walked one path for decades. Now walk another." He wanted to ask questions. Who are you? What is this place? Why me? But the questions dissolved. The answers were unnecessary. It was not about knowledge. It was about movement, presence, and attention, the kind he had given the old station daily but never to himself. The man stepped aside, revealing a long corridor of faint light and distant murmurs. Without being told, Mr. O'Donnell understood he must walk it. He stepped forward. The corridor was lined with doors, each numbered but without pattern. 4, then 19, then 4 again, then 78, then 11:17. His breath caught. He touched that door. It vibrated gently, like a living pulse. He did not open it. Not yet. Instead, he continued walking deeper, where the numbers became less orderly and more symbolic: curves, spirals, constellations. Somewhere behind him, the clocks began ticking softly, like rain on a window. They did not measure time. They revealed it. At last the corridor opened into a vast garden beneath an endless dusk sky. Trains of impossible design glided along tracks woven into the landscape like vines, silent, sleek, glowing from within. Some vanished mid-air like fading thoughts. Others slowed as if acknowledging him. A wooden bench sat at the garden's edge. For the first time in this strange new existence, he felt tired, not old, not worn, but tired in the way one feels after waking into possibility. He sat. A train approached, not the one that had brought him here, but another, painted deep emerald with windows of soft amber light. It slowed to a near stop, though no conductor appeared and no whistle blew. Instead, a single door opened with a sigh like autumn wind. Inside he glimpsed silhouettes not strangers, but lives he had never chosen. Versions of himself reading, traveling, laughing, living in ways he had never permitted beneath the weight of routine. They did not beckon him. They simply existed waiting if he wished to board. He closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and for the first time in perhaps his entire lifetime, he did not know what would happen next. And it was beautiful. Mr. O'Donnell kept his eyes closed for a long, slow breath as the soft hum of the emerald train lingered in the air like a warm mist that refused to fade. The open door of the train glowed with an amber light that felt patient rather than urgent. It waited without pressure. It invited without demanding. It held a gentle pulse like a heartbeat from a world that wished only to be seen. When he opened his eyes, the silhouettes inside shifted slightly, as if adjusting themselves in a polite attempt to appear more welcoming. These were not ghosts. They were not illusions. They were not warnings. They were versions of him that had stepped onto paths he had never dared explore. One version sat with a book open on his lap, looking relaxed and content, as if he had spent years soaking in sunlight instead of the gray routine of the 1117 platform. Another version walked with confident steps across a field of something bright and green. A third leaned against a window, with a faraway stare filled with dreams that had not been set aside in the name of duty. Mr. O'Donnell felt a strange tightness in his chest. Not fear, not sorrow. Something lighter, something like discovery. The breeze in the garden shifted. The sky above rolled gently with slow-moving streaks of violet and silver. A thought rose inside him that perhaps this place was not outside time at all. Perhaps it was time itself offering him a seat in its quiet carriage. He stood from the wooden bench. His shoes pressed softly into the mossy ground, sending small ripples of pale light across the garden floor. He approached the open door of the emerald train. He lifted one foot to step inside. But before the sole of his shoe touched the glowing threshold, a soft sound reached him. A single click. The sound was unmistakable. The sound he had heard every day for decades. The sound of his brass ticket punch slicing through thick paper. The sound echoed gently through the garden, though there were no passengers and no tickets in sight. He lowered his foot back to the ground and turned toward the source. A path had appeared where moments earlier there had been only stillness. It wound through tall silver reeds that swayed slightly with every click. With each step he took toward the path, the sound grew a little stronger. Not loud, never harsh. Just steady, familiar, like an old friend tapping him on the shoulder. The emerald train did not vanish. Its door stayed open as if acknowledging that some journeys were not meant to be taken just yet. He followed the path. The reeds brushed gently against his sleeves, leaving faint trails of shimmering dust. The garden shifted around him in slow pulses as if breathing in rhythm with his steps. At the end of the path he found another door. Not a door to a train. Not a door to a chamber. Just a plain wooden door standing alone without walls or hinges. The wood grain formed swirling patterns that moved slowly like sleepy water under moonlight. He reached for the handle. The moment his hand touched it, the door drifted inward without resistance. Behind it lay a narrow corridor lit by a soft golden haze. The air felt warm and familiar. More familiar than anything in the garden. More familiar than the Hall of Clocks. More familiar even than the old station on the edge of his former life. He stepped inside. The corridor opened into a room. A single lamp sat on a table. A pot of milky tea sent gentle warmth into the air. The scent was unmistakable. It was the scent of the tea he drank at 1117 every day without fail. A coat hung on a hook in the corner. A small framed photograph rested on a shelf. It showed him as a younger man standing beside a fireplace. His face was relaxed. His smile was soft and natural, not carved by routine. He approached the shelf. Next to the photograph lay a folded sheet of thick paper. He opened it. The same familiar handwriting greeted him. It read, "You walked your path with care. Now learn who you were when the world was quiet." He let out a long, slow breath. His fingers brushed the edges of the paper. The letters seemed to soften beneath his touch as if the message itself was alive. He placed the sheet back on the shelf and stepped further into the room. A chair waited beside the lamp. He lowered himself into it. As soon as he did, the room shifted ever so slightly. Not visibly, not physically, just in feeling. The air grew warmer, the walls breathed like gentle lungs. The lamp brightened just enough to let him see beyond the surface of the room. Beneath the glow, he saw a faint outline on the floor. A circular mark, as if the chair had been placed there many times before. He looked up. Across from him stood another figure. Not the shadowed guide from the Hall of Clocks. This figure was shorter with gentler shoulders and hair that held the color of late autumn leaves. She wore a plain dress and held a cup of tea in her hand. Her eyes were soft and calm. She looked at him not with surprise but with recognition, as if she had been waiting for him across countless mornings he had never lived. He tried to speak but no sound came. She offered him a small smile. Then she set her cup on the table and took one slow step toward him. The room thickened with silence. The kind of silence that holds memories still unspoken yet already understood. She opened her mouth to speak. But before a single word formed, the lamp flickered once, then twice. Then the entire room shifted as if something heavy had brushed against reality itself. A soft, distant whistle rose through the floor. A train whistle, but not any whistle he had ever heard before. It carried a tone that felt ancient and new at the same time. The tea in the pot trembled. The wooden walls trembled with it. The woman froze. Her eyes widened not in fear but in recognition. Then the whistle sounded again, louder, clearer, calling him. And the floor beneath his chair began to glow. The floor beneath Mr. O'Donnell glowed with a soft pale gold as though the wood itself had become liquid light. The woman with autumn-colored hair stood perfectly still, her cup of tea untouched, her eyes fixed on the widening circle of brightness under his chair. The whistle rose again, this time steady and near like a train pulling into a station that did not exist in ordinary daylight. The room breathed slowly, its walls pulsing as if alive. The floor continued to brighten until Mr. O'Donnell felt warmth through the solace of his shoes, the warmth of sun-soaked stones after rain. The woman took another step toward him, her expression calm but filled with a certain weight of meaning. She reached out her hand as though offering him something invisible yet needed. He lifted his own hand, their fingers nearly touching, when a pulse of light surged upward from the glowing ring and wrapped around him like a veil. His breath caught. The chair beneath him softened into nothing. The room dissolved like fog lifting from morning grass. The woman remained only for one final moment, her eyes filled with quiet acceptance, her hand still reaching toward him. Then she faded, gentle as dusk. He stood not in the warm room, nor in the garden, but beside a railway track that glimmered like silver laid across the surface of a still lake. The sky above stretched in violet haze without sun or moon. The whistle called again, and from the horizon a train appeared. It rolled silently over the shimmering track, its wheels cutting no sound, its engine drawing no smoke. The carriages were made of something like glass, though, thicker, softer, and glowing faintly from within. The light they held was neither bright nor dim, but steady like the beat of a heart that had never known rush or rest. Mr. O'Donnell stepped closer. The track reflected his face like a mirror, not aged, not worn, simply present. The train slowed until it hovered before him, weightless as a thought. The nearest door opened with a long sigh. He waited, expecting passengers shaped silhouettes like before. But this carriage was empty. No seats, no windows. Only a wide hall lined with faint golden markings on the floor that curved like railway maps drawn by memory instead of ink. He entered the carriage. The door closed behind him with gentle finality. The train moved, but he felt no motion, only a shift in the air like turning a page. The hall brightened slowly, revealing that each marking on the floor led toward a different archway. Some glowed with pale green light, others with warm amber. One arch shimmered in deep blue like ocean depths, lit by distant lanterns. Mr. O'Donnell brushed his fingertips along the rail beside him, though he felt no texture, only the suggestion of form. He chose the golden arch at the far end simply because it felt like the first line of a story waiting to be read. Beyond the arch was a vast open space where tracks hung in midair, crossing like threads in a loom. Trains moved along them without rails or wheels, as though gliding through water. Some trains were tiny like toy models, others were long and strange shaped like thoughts stretched across memory. On one track, a train passed filled with passengers holding lanterns that never flickered. On another, a carriage drifted slowly, carrying only books stacked to the ceiling. Titles shimmered faintly on the spines but vanished before they could be read. A voice spoke behind him, though no lips formed the sound. It whispered like cloth brushing against still air. Every journey walked repeats until understood. He turned. The shadowed guide stood again, coat shimmering like evening light through smoke. The guide raised one hand and a second track formed at their feet, glowing with soft red light. It curved into darkness ahead but pulsed like something alive waiting. The guide spoke without speaking, just as before. You know this path. You lived it one click at a time. Mr. O'Donnell stared at the red track and felt something shift behind his ribs. A memory opened. The gate. The tickets. The brass punch in his hand. Day after day, year after year, the 11:17 train. The milky tea, the repetition that had been comfort and prison both. He stepped toward the track and air rippled like heat above stone. The guide watched, silent, patient, eternal. Mr. O'Donnell placed one foot onto the glowing red line. The instant he did, time folded inward. He stood again on the platform of his station, though not the same station. The colors were brighter, yet duller, as if time had been freshly painted, but with old brushes. The train stood before him. The letters on the side gleamed with fresh paint. Passengers walked past him, though none looked at him directly. He heard the familiar click of his punch, though it was not in his hand. It echoed from someone else. He turned slowly. At the gate stood a younger version of himself. Hair darker. Shoulders straighter. Eyes tired but steady. He watched the younger self punch ticket after ticket. Each click fell like rain. Slow. Predictable. Unending. Mr. O'Donnell tried to speak, but sound would not form. He stepped closer. The passengers moved through him like mist. He reached toward the younger man, but his fingers passed through air. The young version of himself paused, wiped his brow, took another ticket, and placed the punch against it. Click. The older Mr. O'Donnell closed his eyes and understood. This was not memory. It was repetition. The same eternal day. The same rhythm. Click. 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 The whistle blew. The scene warped. The train shimmered. The platform blurred. He opened his eyes again. The shadowed guide stood beside him. The station melted into starlight. The tracks into rivers of light. The guide lifted one hand slowly, as though offering a final path. And from the distance, a new train emerged, unlike any he had seen before. Its engine glowed with white fire. Its windows burned like dawn. Its whistle rose once more, shaking every thread of this strange realm. It was coming straight toward him. Fast. The train of white fire rushed through the realm like a living sunrise across the surface of winter water. Its wheels did not touch tracks. Its body did not cast shadow. It simply moved through existence with the quiet authority of something that had always been and would always be. Mr. O'Donnell stood still as the glowing carriage approached, until it seemed the sky itself parted for its arrival. The shadowed guide remained at his side, silent, unblinking, unmoving. As the train drew closer, Mr. O'Donnell felt warmth rising through his chest like tea through chilled fingers. It did not burn. It did not frighten. It simply expanded inside him until he felt lighter than breath. The train stopped before him without sound. No hiss, no steam, no slowing metal. It simply was still. A single door opened with a soft pulse of gold like the blink of a tired star. Inside he saw no seats, no windows, no passengers. Only a corridor that stretched forward into light so soft it felt like sleep. He turned to the guide, hoping for direction, though none was spoken. The guide offered a slow nod, so gentle it felt like the turning of a leaf in autumn air. He stepped forward and entered. At the moment his foot touched the glowing corridor, the world shifted. Not sharply, not violently. Instead, like snow settling after a long fall. He felt the station fall away behind him. The gardens, the clocks, the versions of himself. All of it receded like the tide pulling memory back into deep ocean. He walked through the train with slow, measured steps. The light around him pulsed in rhythm with his heart. Or perhaps his heart pulsed to match the light. It was impossible to know. There was no time here, only movement. After what felt like one step or 1,000, the corridor widened into a grand hall. The ceiling arched high overhead like the curve of dawn. The walls shone with faint etchings that flowed like ink in water. They told stories, though none in words. Stories of rails that crossed worlds. Stories of men who punched tickets in silence. Stories of repetition and the strange comfort of patterns. In the center of the hall stood a table made of pale stone. On it rested a brass punch, his punch, the same shape, the same weight, the same familiar curve in the handle from decades of use. He approached and placed his hand upon it. The metal warmed beneath his fingers. Not memory, not illusion. Something real, something earned. His pulse slowed until it felt like the soft rhythm of wheels on distant track. He lifted the punch from the table. The moment he did, all the etched walls shimmered. Patterns rippled outward as if every story ever lived felt the shift. The hall brightened. The air deepened with sound like the echo of whistles carried across endless fields. A voice formed around him, not loud but immense. Walk forward. Punch once. Change what repeats. He did not know whose voice it was. Time itself, perhaps. Or the patient hand of fate that waited through quiet decades for him to arrive. He walked to the far end of the hall where a door waited, shaped from pure light. It slid open with neither touch nor force. Beyond it lay a platform. His platform. Tracks stretching into mist. The bench. The gate. The faint gray sky above that never rushed nor paused. The station of his longest day. He stepped out. Passengers flowed around him. Not the passengers of memory, but passengers newly formed, alive, present. None saw him. None touched him. He moved through them like wind through tall grass. Ahead at the gate stood the younger version of himself once more, punch in hand. Shoulders heavy with routine, yet steady with duty. The younger man lifted a ticket. The older Mr. O'Donnell watched the familiar click form in ghostly anticipation. He felt the brass punch in his own hand warm with possibility. He stepped toward the younger man. The train at the platform shimmered. The clock above the arch hung still without numbers. Time paused like a breath held by the world itself. He raised the punch slowly, then placed it against the ticket in the young man's hand. Click. Sound rippled through every version of reality like a stone dropped through still lake. The younger man froze. His hand trembled. He looked up for the first time across decades and saw himself. Eyes meeting eyes across an impossible divide. The platform brightened. The train glowed. A single ripple of golden light spread outward along the floor like dawn unfolding. Passengers stopped mid-step. A cup of tea on a table steamed upward, and the steam held shape like a blooming tree. In the distance, another train appeared through the mist, moving slow, steady, certain. The younger man lowered his punch. The older one lowered his as well. The two versions of himself stood side by side, though they did not touch. The silence deepened, warmer than before, softer than ritual. The younger version took a breath and stepped away from the gate for the first time in the eternal day. The passengers waited. The timetable did not move. The whistle did not blow. Yet the world flowed onward as though it accepted this shift with gentle approval. The older Mr. O'Donnell felt the ground beneath his feet steady with new meaning. The younger man looked at him again, then turned toward the tracks and began to walk. Not toward the train, not toward the crowd, but beyond. Beyond the schedule. Beyond the routine. Toward something unseen. The station shimmered like heat above stone. The brass punch in the older man's hand glowed brighter until it was difficult to look at. He sensed another threshold, another choice, another step. And as he turned to follow the younger self into the unfolding horizon, a shadow crossed overhead. Soft at first, then darker. A shape like wings of smoke and silver sweeping across the vaulted sky of time. It descended slowly, purposefully. The year turned once more like a millstone grinding slowly through time, and with it the rhythm of the town changed again. What had been whispers grew into discussions, and what had been rumors became expectations heavy enough to bend branches. Markets bustled with merchants from lands whose names sounded like wind brushing through reeds. Scholars drew maps with trembling hands, trying to capture the shape of the unknown. Mothers hushed children not with fear now, but with wonder, as though they stood at the edge of something colossal, ancient, and inevitable. The library atop the eastern hill, once forgotten beneath ivy and dust, now thrummed like a heartbeat beneath moonlight. Doors that had not opened in generations swung freely, as though remembering their purpose. Elders claimed they heard murmurs within its stone bones, parchment shifting, pens scratching, ink rewriting itself in margins untouched by hands. Some said the library was alive, awakening after centuries of sleep. Others insisted it was merely imagination thickened by nostalgia, but no one could deny the change. The council meetings became longer. Candles burned to stumps before final decisions could be carved into the night. Debate swirled. Should they continue expanding outward, or focus inward on the knowledge resurfacing like fossils after rainfall? One counselor, with eyes like tarnished brass, warned that any growth built without wisdom would crumble. Another argued that wisdom gained without action turned to rot, like fruit left too long under shade. Voices clashed, braiding into something complex and unresolvable. The only agreement was uncertainty, the kind that stretched into the future like an unwritten page. Beyond the walls, caravans grew more frequent. Traders brought spices that tasted like sunlight and minerals that shimmered like broken constellations. With them came stories of cities where towers scraped the belly of clouds, of seas that shone red as though reflecting the memory of fire, of mountains that moved like sleeping beasts beneath snow. Each tale stirred hunger beneath the town's ribs. What else had the world hidden? What knowledge had been lost? What could be regained? The younger generation felt this most strongly. They gathered under lanterns by the river, faces glowing gold, books on knees like shields or wings. They studied the old maps, sought patterns in the stars, argued about the future the way children used to argue about games. No one told them to stop. Even the elders who had once scolded curiosity for its sharpness, now watched with a strange reverence, as though they finally recognized curiosity not as chaos, but as direction. The river carried their laughter through the dark, echoing like water finding new channels. Meanwhile, the archives grew deeper. Corridors lengthened like roots beneath the earth, chests unlocked themselves, and ink patterns on scrolls shifted subtly when no one watched. A young scholar named Arin was the first to notice. He studied a particular manuscript daily, a treatise on forgotten navigation. One evening, as fireflies blinked like errant stars beyond the window, he realized the diagrams were different. Compass marks he had memorized had rotated by a degree. Lines charting oceans had thickened, darkened, twisted slightly north. The change was small, but undeniable, like the first ripple before a tidal wave. He told the council. They doubted, of course. But Arin was patient, and the manuscript continued to change. By the 7th week, the diagrams glowed faintly blue under moonlight, and no one could claim ignorance. Something where someone wanted to be understood. The council authorized a new expedition. Preparations lasted months. Ships were built not of ordinary timber, but of reinforced cedar infused with powdered crystal. Sails were woven with thread dipped in moon-tinted dyes, resistant to gales from beyond known waters. The town watched from the cliffs as the vessels were launched, 5 in total, sturdy as promise. Children threw wildflowers from the heights. Mothers pressed blessings into the wind. Fathers walked away quickly, so no one would see their eyes shine. Arin was chosen to lead the scholars aboard the second vessel. He did not boast when his name was called. He simply bowed, the weight of purpose settling across his shoulders like a cloak. He spent his nights reading the manuscript that guided them, and sometimes it felt like the manuscript read him back. New symbols appeared like breath on glass. New roots branched like veins beneath skin. It was alive, and it was waiting. The day of departure arrived beneath the sky, the color of deep salt water. The town gathered along the harbor, bodies pressed close like pages in a book. Drums rolled low, steady, like the opening sentence of a story long overdue. Arin stepped aboard, inhaling the scent of wood, ocean, ink, and destiny. The fleet moved as one, sails swelling, ropes tightening, water splitting beneath iron-forged keels. The harbor shrank behind them like a fading memory, yet rhythm lingered in the air like a pulse. The journey was long, measured not only by distance but by transformation. Weeks became months. The ocean was not one ocean, but many, moods shifting from glass to teeth, from lullaby to roar. Storms rose like ancient leviathans, but the ships cut through them with purpose sharper than fear. Arin stood often at the stern. The ever-changing manuscript unfurled before him, pages fluttering like a heartbeat. Sometimes new landmasses appeared inked where only ocean had been. Sometimes entire coastlines vanished, as though rewritten by invisible thought. They followed anyway. They trusted the unknown because the unknown had called. At last, after storms, after calm seas, after nights so quiet even the stars held their breath, they reached it, a coast unlike any in history. Black sand glittered like powdered obsidian, and stone pillars rose from the shore like cathedral spires carved by giants. Between them, faint symbols pulsed like veins of thought. The air shimmered with something old, older than ink, older than memory, older even than fear. The crew stepped onto the shore, their boots sinking into ash-soft grain. The earth hummed beneath their bones. Arin placed the manuscript upon the sand, and the sand responded. Symbols burned brighter. The ground trembled like a sleeping titan stirring. From beneath the pillars came light, slow first, then radiant, approaching like dawn from beneath the earth. A door began to form, carved not by tools but by intention itself. Stone folded inward like parchment, revealing a corridor descending into darkness older than history. The expedition lit torches. They stepped inside. Behind them, the ocean exhaled. Ahead of them, knowledge waited like a vast, breathing horizon. In a quiet town where time moved like a slow river, a forgotten library awakened, rewriting itself, whispering secrets, changing maps, and pulling humanity toward mysteries buried beyond history. Curiosity grew into destiny, and a young scholar named Arin answered the call. Guided by a living manuscript and a future no one could predict, he led an expedition across oceans unknown, through storms that tested the soul and into a land shaped by ancient intelligence, where stone itself breathed memory. And as the world stepped beyond the edge of the known, one truth echoed louder than fear. The greatest discoveries are not found, they awaken, just like courage, just like destiny. If stories like this move your heart, open your mind, and keep you awake long after the last word, then don't just leave. Subscribe to Stories Before Sleep, where every night a new world opens.